All right, everybody, welcome to our Friday weekly workshop. And today we have Dom from Spiral Circus Games here. And Dom has been working in a team to build this game that we noticed about a year and a half ago. And it had this limbo-esque type of feel to it. Very exciting. Super excited about having it come in and experience it, and it was just it had this underwater trippy scuba diver going through it, and there was all these like animals and particles and fish, and it had this incredible feel. So I was very interested in seeing if we can get Dominique down here and have this company here to tell us and show us what this game is all about. So I was so fortunate that Dom reached out and we were able to connect. And I'm telling you guys right now, Silt is going to be one of the games that people talk about in 2022 because it is utterly beautiful. It's so surreal. It's so fantastic, and I really want you guys to see what this game looks like because it's going to blow everyone away. So Dom, thank you for being here. Can you give us? How about I kind of pass this on over to you,
Sure.
and give us a walkthrough and experience of what you're going to present.
All right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that was a really kind introduction. I do hope that the game does eventually live up to those words. And thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here. So yeah, I'm Dom. I'm the sort of technical half of Spiral Circus. We're a two-person studio based in Bristol and Cardiff in the UK. Uh, we work basically completely remotely. And the sort of team on the game is the two of us, and then me and Tom, who's the other name on that slide. And then we have two basically half-time contractors, so somebody that does audio and somebody that does animation, and that's the majority. I'd say about 99%, 95% of the work on Silt is done in that group. So I was going to talk to you a little bit about how we formed the company and like where we came from, because neither of us before we Silt is our first game, and neither of us like had any experience in video games at all before we started doing this. And so maybe there's an interesting tale there. But so I'll explain how we met and how we got into games, and then I'll talk about like how we formed the sort of the underlying concept for Silt, which is what we then ended up pitching to a accelerator program, which gave us some time to work on the game where we didn't have to worry about money and stuff like that, right? Basically, so we had like an 8-week excursion. I'll talk about that. And then from that period, we built a demo, we pitched it to a publisher, and then we eventually got a publishing deal. And the rest of the game was built off of the advance from the publishing deal. So I'll go into a little bit of that process, and then I'll talk you through the game a little bit, give you our little 5-slide pitch of the game, and then maybe talk a little bit about sort of some of the technical challenges that we had in the game, because we do things a little bit differently to how a lot of games do things, and maybe there's some interesting stuff in there. And then we'll, I guess, open it up to questions after that, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So here's me in 2012 at the top left there, I think. So I used to be a scientist. I did a physics degree, and then I sort of sidestepped into a biology department to do a PhD program. Um, Up until the point I started my PhD, I had managed to completely avoid learning to code. I thought I was completely uninterested in it. There was like C++ courses offered at my physics degree, but I just never took them, was never interested. But then I started my PhD, and like week one, my boss gives me this giant software project, like this piece of software that a PhD student had spent like 3 years building, and just told me to like extract the main chunk of that and take out the bit that deals with bats and make it work with bees instead, basically, right? So like take the chunk, take the heart out of this piece of code and like replace it with something that we could use. And I don't know why, but I just went, sure, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was just like the start, trial by fire, learn to code. And it just sort of carried on from there, really. I think that's a PhD student's like it's a pretty universal experience. You basically get dropped in and you hit the ground running and you're just told to learn stuff. Um, so that was my like intro into coding. You can see some of the work here. It's not particularly relevant, but I used to do weird work with bumblebees and electric fields. There's a picture of David Attenborough sitting in front of one of my beehives talking about it on one of his shows.
That's incredible.
So the programming work was kind of dry, but like lots of data analysis, lots of experimental automation, like automation and stuff, and then automatic data collection, and then loads and loads of like plotting, physics modeling, that kind of stuff. So lots of high performance stuff, but you know, not really things with complicated user interfaces like games. So just lots of data analysis, basically, very dull. But weirdly, I found that programming was like my favorite part of that job, and I just sort of took to it really quickly. And over the kind of years that I was doing that, I just started developing like I really wanted to make a game basically. Before I'd learned to program, I thought games were kind of magical and I didn't know how people made them and I never thought I could make them. But then, you start playing around with Unity and you realize like, oh yeah, so these are the building blocks that go into games. Maybe I can do this. And I'm sure you've all had that feeling too, because you're all in this course. Um, so yeah, so I basically just was making Unity games in my spare time, just programmer art, like little projects, things that would teach me something, like I'll make something so that I can learn pathfinding and then make something so that I can learn, I don't know, like a value driven AI and things like that, just like learn one thing from the world of games programming by making a little prototype in it and then ditch it and move on.
Yeah.
So I'd been doing this for a long time, but I like sucked at art and I sucked at making anything look good. So I was really looking to find an artist. And firstly, there's nothing wrong with programmer art. Like there's been some great games made with programmer art. I just didn't feel like mine was
Yeah.
gonna make it.
It's a whole lot easier just to bring in that talent, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So in the same time, who's now my business partner, Tom, was a professional artist working out of Bristol, out of the same city I was in. And he draws these beautiful, big pen and ink things. So like the original of that one on the left is about 8 foot tall. It's an enormous black ink on canvas. And yeah, so he has this whole career of doing this kind of stuff. He's done some work for Aardman, done some work for I think he might have dipped into video game background animation at some point, but just as a contractor. He's done set painting for films, things like that. So he was just immersed in the art world, basically.
Hmm.
Um, and it just so happened that we ended up at a New Year's party together. And I found out he was an artist and that he'd just about dabbled in games. And so I basically cornered him and said, please make a game with me, make a game with me, make a game with me. And I showed him all my prototypes and I got really nerdy and excited and stuff. And for whatever reason, that didn't scare him off. And we went to like 2 weeks later, just to a pub to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And he showed me some watercolors he'd been working on recently. So he was going through a phase of drawing his characters all drowning in horrible abysses, which was just what he was into at the time. And we were talking about maybe what games we could make or whatever. So we sort of settled on this idea that like, that's a really nice image, the image of like a sort of skinny, vulnerable diver in a really terrifying abyss. Like that's a cool place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened that the center panel there was a painting called Silt. So that's where the game got its name. On the bottom right there, you can see his drawing desk and some of the, I think this is a bit later on the drawing desk, but it's got some Silt art in it as well. So we started just purely from concept art, and that will be like a theme throughout all of this is Tom decides how the game looks, and then it's my job to like make that happen in Unity somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the process for everything. So from there, I like built loads of little things, just rendering tests, really, just lots, or getting the diver kind of control schemes in, getting some animation rigs in, getting the absolute bare bones, so that we could potentially pitch this thing to somebody. So you can see the really early ones don't look anything like what it ended up looking like, but we might be testing, I don't know, just the little things that we would need. We would need like parallaxing backgrounds, and we figured we'd need like decent lighting on the 2D rigs. So lots of tests for that, lots of tests for like fish AI and stuff like that. And you can see how we sort of eventually ended up on the right there, like settling on this this really black and white look um, for Silt. So we put all of that together, and we had like 3 or 4 simple little levels where we could kind of show the look and feel of it all. I think at the time we thought we might make it open world and really explory based, but that all got shut down later.
Now, how long did this process take for you? Because I see the 3 years ago tags, but in building all these different looks, how long did it take for you to eventually get to that one? Yes, this is where this is how we're going to progress.
Well, we we were both still working, so I was still at the science job, which was full time, and Tom was doing, whatever artists do for money, like painting commissions and all that kind of stuff. So we were both still working full time. We didn't really have a great deal of time to spend on this. So we probably spent maybe think about like 3 or 4 months building out these things.
Okay.
Um, and then we started like applying in earnest to things that would get us started, right? We got to the point where it's like, right, we'll quit the job, but we need something that will like give us some money to get started so that we can, you know, really do something with this and not just be like struggling to pay the rent in 6 months. And
Hmm. Hmm.
so we took these little pitches and we pitched them to a few places. But the one that we really wanted to get on, and it ended up being the one we did get on, was this thing called Stugan. So unfortunately, I don't think they're still running. It ran for about 4 or 5 years in Sweden. It might come back again. So if you ever get a chance, apply for it because it's amazing. It doesn't matter where you're from. You see the people in that bottom picture. So
Hmm.
between them, there's maybe about 10, 15 dev teams. And we're all in about the same place, right? Some of them have got AAA experience and they're branching out on their own to make an indie. Some of them have come from different backgrounds, like me and Tom had. Some of them have come from, just having an indie studio and they wanted some time to make their second game or whatever. Um, and I don't know, like you can see one of them is Adam Robertson Yu in the center in the center right with the at the back with the plaid shirt on. So he made a short hike while he was there. And then right behind him is Tim Dawson, and below him is Ren Breyer, and they made Unpacking, which just came out this year. So we were all brand new back then, and it's nice to see that we're all getting to about a release stage for some of our games now, which is really cool. So yeah, they put us in this ski lodge in Sweden. It turned out not to be a cult, which was great. None of us really knew that going in. There was people from everywhere in the world, so basically every continent was represented there.
Hmm.
And they did things like brought in mentors from the industry on the weekends. They put on a sort of end of session show where we had to kind of show what we did. So there was a little bit of accountability and a goal to work towards there. But otherwise, they just looked after us and let us make our game. They didn't ask anything of us or anything like that. They just gave us a place and looked after us while we worked, and it was lovely.
Now, how long, out of curiosity, how long did this experience last, and
It
how were
was
you guys selected?
it was 8 weeks, and it was a simple sort of application form. We did a 2-minute video and had a little pitch deck, and they just worked through them. I think they were looking for kind of strange, interesting ideas. Um, but yeah, I'm not really sure what their inner process for picking the game was. I
Mhm.
think, like I said, some people were more established, so it wasn't just about brand new people coming in. I think they just wanted to help out games they thought were interesting, I think.
Gotcha.
Um, so this was run by Tommy Palm and Yana Palm. So Tommy he was the CEO at King when Candy Crush got super big.
Okay.
He has a bunch of he has a studio in Stockholm now that makes his own stuff. So lovely people, and it was funded by a bunch of cool people from Swedish game dev companies like Avalanche and Dice and Landfall Games, the totally accurate battle simulator people. So yeah, lovely thing. If you ever see it advertised again, please apply because it was the best thing we ever did.
Mhm.
Just put you in this picturesque place to make the game. So this is where we built our demo. And the demo is that was the level we needed to get to really pitch for a publisher or something, right? Like we couldn't show what we had before this because it was basically nothing. And because we hadn't made a game before, we had no credentials. We knew we needed to make something that looked nice. So we spent a lot of time focusing on like the art style and the rendering and everything, just so we could get a really solid looking little small playable thing and build a trailer out of it and then build a pitch deck out of it. So when we left there, we had some ammo to pitch with. And we started trying pitch things. And the event that ended up being really useful for us was this event in London called the Games Finance Market. But I'm sure there are things like this wherever you are. So it was kind of like speed dating, but for like indies, well, game developers and money people, basically. So either publishers, kind of VC investor types. There was a big like presence from people like Tencent and stuff like that there, but there were also much smaller publishers. And we met a load of cool people there, but we ended up talking a lot with Sold Out, who are our current publisher. So that was the kind of process we went through. We got our first meeting with them and then just sort of proceeded to keep meeting with them afterwards. And I'm happy to answer questions about this, but it's quite a slow, boring process. We just went through, establishing the idea that they wanted to make our game, they wanted to help. And then we had to sort of they did due diligence on us, check that we kind of know what we're building, that we're asking for the right amount of money. I mean, I'm sure somebody will tell you this in other situations, but I think one of the most important things that we had in our pitch was a really clear idea of how much it would cost.
That is
Um,
exactly where I wanted to get to. How did you determine that and to pitch that to somebody and say, I need 500,000 to make this work?
right, yeah. So we picked a salary that we were okay with, Tom and I,
Hmm.
and we were planning on making a game in 2 years. Like that was we knew a publisher isn't gonna, they're not that interested in anything that takes longer than 2 years because it's a long time to wait for a return. So 2 years was about a window of what we felt comfortable asking. We asked some friends about kind of budget levels that they were looking at, but again, there's so much. Like we ended up asking for about £300,000, which is that's tiny really in the scheme of
Hmm.
things. So we were looking at smaller publishers. Some people at that games finance market were like, if you're not asking for £10 million, I'm not interested in talking to you. Whereas some of them were looking to fund games for much less than that. So that's what we ended up with Sold
Well,
Out.
we can ask, but are you going to give us 10 million?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, so in terms of like budgeting the game out, we were working with uh, our two main contractors now who do animation and sound, and we just asked them for quotes basically. So we kind of built out a rough like length and spec of the game, figured out how many, for the sound guy, like how many spot effects are in here, how many scenes and what music would we need in a game like this, and he gave us a rough quote. And so like that was how much it was going to cost us to pay for his time for like 2 years at about this rate of using time.
Hmm.
And then we did the same with the animator. Like I said, we added our salaries, we added how much we would need for things like the Unity Pro license, which we would become eligible to have to buy if we got this funding, Photoshop licensing, all the stuff that you would need for that. And then like a little bit of overhead. And I think we also budgeted in like for each of the contractors, let's have another like 50 days of pickup time in
Hmm.
case we need it, right? And I do think it's important I think a publisher will spot if you've like really taken it to the line with how much money that you're asking for. I think they would rather you ask for a comfortable amount of money than you look like you don't know how much money a game costs to make.
Okay.
So like a lot of people try to like pitch the smallest budget possible. And I think it's quite obvious to a lot of publishers that you just can't make a game for that and you'll be in cash flow problems like halfway through it. So
Hmm.
so find out what you think it's going to cost, give yourself a salary that you can live on and all of that kind of stuff. If you ask for less than that, I don't think people will take it seriously anyway.
Hmm.
So you got to live, you got to eat, you got to pay the people that work for you. Make sure that's asked for. Um, and then I think that went a really long way, like just being serious and having a serious idea of how much this thing was going to cost. And we also did some work around like trying to put the game inside, like, what are our closest competitors? What are the games that are on the market that they could look at to see how they sold and what their budget was? And so that ended up being a big part of their due diligence, right? It's like putting us into a pot with other games like this and projecting how much money they might be able to make off of the game.
Gotcha.
Um,
Gotcha.
and then just time management, right? So we had a due diligence producer come out to us at the beginning, and like we had a Gantt chart ready, and they were very happy that we had a Gantt chart ready, you know, like that we thought about how long time, like what the dependencies were for this project, who was going to work when, all of that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
So that was what went into the heart of the pitch. Ultimately, it was successful. But that's not to say that we didn't pitch other places that weren't interested, or that we talked to a few times and then weren't interested, you know? So like, don't expect to just be successful because you have all of that. But like, I think one thing about the games finance market that really helps is that it's like a shotgun approach, right? You meet loads of people and you can really quickly narrow down. Like, I think we maybe had like 30 meetings in 2 days.
Mm.
They're all like 10, 15-minute pitches. And you can see the ones that, you know, just stop talking to you right now, they're not interested. And some of the ones that are a bit interested, and they tend not to waste your time, or at least that's our experience. Like, they see enough games, they don't need to chase around games they don't think they want to sign. So
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, so that's how we got the game funded. And then we've been on that publisher schedule for the last 2 years. So I can talk to you a little bit about the game now, or would you like to break for questions about financing? Or
Yeah, if anybody has questions, when with the publisher, of course you have a certain deadline that you have to meet. If you don't hit that deadline, they're not going to give you any more money. It's pretty much up to you, correct?
right, so that was all agreed upon
Mm-hmm.
before we signed the contract. We had a tentative schedule,
Yep.
and that was literally down to the level of like, we will deliver, like, we basically broke the game down into sections.
Mm-hmm.
So the structure of Silt is in kind of like based on a per biome thing. So we have 7 or 8 scenes in each biome,
Mm-hmm.
and we basically had 3-month milestones where we would produce one of those biomes each time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that involved like the number of assets, the new kind of new creatures in Silt. That's what the new content was, like a boss type character, all the terrains and puzzle designs and everything like that. So
Mm-hmm.
every 3 months we would deliver a milestone that basically had that in it,
Gotcha.
and that was agreed upon at the beginning. And also they agreed upon, like, it's really important to have this in your contract, right? Is like, they defined very carefully what the milestone pass quality would look like.
Mm-hmm.
So when they say deliver us this in alpha quality in the milestone, that alpha quality has a table in the contract that says like, right, that alpha quality means it doesn't have to be final art, it doesn't have to be exact final animations, things have to work, but the designs have to be, you know, close to final, you know. So there's a whole list of things that you're allowed to like
Mm-hmm.
not make the sort of finished version of this game at this point. They understand very well that games are like, they
Yeah.
take a lot of iterating and things like that.
Was
So we
there?
essentially,
Oh,
sorry,
go
go ahead.
ahead, please.
No,
Please.
no, go ahead.
Was there a lot of creative feedback both ways, or did they just basically say, "Well, you satisfied our agreement. You keep progressing forward"?
They were, so our producers that we got from Sold Out were really, really great with us, really supportive, really hands off creatively. Um, what we would do though is that if we had a design change, which you will, you won't stick to the game you pitched 2 years ago by the time you finish it, right? It will be different. Um, all we did was we made sure that we pitched the change to them before we committed to making it. So
Mm-hmm.
anything that might change the wording of that contract, right? Like for instance, Silt had like, in the original schedule, we had these big ideas about hub worlds where you would like go in and then you'd have branching trips off from there. And we abandoned that just because the game design didn't work. Like nothing else really. We just didn't want to make that. It didn't work. So abandoning that, we knew we wanted to. We figured out the kind of case for getting rid of it internally, and we decided internally, and then we pitched it to them before we committed to it, basically. So we just like gave them a chance to say, is this still the game you funded, right? Like, do you still think this game will work if we change it this way? And they never said no, but I think, you know, it would be fair, you know, if we took our main mechanic out because it wasn't working and tried to make some other game, it would be fair to them to say that this isn't the game we funded. We don't think it will sell what we originally thought it would sell, stuff like that, right? So it's totally fair for a publisher to like to make those kinds of demands, to be like,
Yes.
um, you know, you've taken the driving out of this game that we thought was a driving game. Now it's a running game, and like it's not. But um, they weren't trying to control like individual creative decisions with us. They were really good on that front. And to be honest, I don't think most modern publishers are doing that. Like I don't have friends that have said that they've had publishers do that or anything.
Okay. So let's kill the anticipation because I need everybody on here to see how amazing Silt looks. So take us into this because this is going to blow people's minds.
Okay, so still, this is a little bit like the kind of original pitch. The only thing I've taken out is that there's no financials in it. Um, but it's basically this black and white 2D underwater swimming diving game. You play a diver. They're in this underwater world for reasons you don't know. They're very vulnerable. They don't have any particular special abilities apart from the ability to project their soul out of their face mask and to take control of other creatures. So that's the core idea, is that you don't really have any abilities, but all of these different unique creatures do, and you can just take control of them and like use them to solve these environmental puzzles. So in the really simplest case here, this little fish is small enough to get through the little gap at the top left there, where you weren't as the diver.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, if you were to see the rest of this scene, there would be a fish that has through the top left, you go out to the top left, and there's a fish that has like big chompy piranha teeth, and they can bite through those cables, so they can open your way out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're using the abilities of the fish to help you get out where you otherwise wouldn't have been able to get out. So that's the core mechanic of Silt. And then we can vary that by just having more creatures, right, that do different things.
Mm-hmm.
The other kind of pillar here is that at the end of each section of the game, you're going to meet quite a big creature that you can't possess, and you have to sort of outsmart them and put them in a situation where you can like drain their life force, basically. And as I start explaining like the rest of the game, I start to lose words for it because it just gets kind of weird. So you drain the life force from the Goliath, and you end up in this weird giant machine world. And there's a giant machine at the kind of heart of this game that your goal is to just wake it up, turn it on. So I won't go into like the structure of the game much more than that. I think it's one of those things that you just play it and you'll get the vibes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so yeah, and then all of this is built with very handmade, either literally drawn on paper and scanned, or like painted digitally through like lots of scanned artwork that we use as a source. So for example, Tom made loads of texture, loads of color, like, well, we don't use any color, but texture and tonal sheets, lots of assets he can use inside the Photoshop files, things like that. But ultimately, each level is like a fully rendered image that stands alone. You know, there's no tile sets, there's basically no reuse of anything once it's in the sort of terrain file. So it means we can do quite a lot of stuff where we don't have obvious repeats everywhere. We can have like, we're not constrained to like particular shapes of terrain, you know, like we can have jaggy edges and cave walls and stalactites and things like that without having the tile set like not sit on the grid. You know, there's no real grid or anything like that. So it gives Tom the ability to be quite free form with the way he draws. And then, you know, a big chunk of the technical side of this game was creating the pipeline to allow us to do that.
Talk to us about this. Just so that the students understand. Usually in 2D games, you use sprite sheets. You use reusable sprites over and over again, either through tile maps or you try to reduce the amount of textures that are in scene to reduce draw calls. If you have too many in there, you're gonna blow up your computer. It's gonna slow everything down. But every asset that these guys are using is unique, hand drawn, once only, and then it's done. And these aren't usually like you can build an environment like a back wall. I could take a small little sprite sheet and repeat it 50 times and create a back wall. This is like a hand sketched, created piece of art, and the whole thing, the 1080 by 1080 sprite is on there. So this is where I'm curious, like, how did this process occur? Explain this and how it was optimized to work well.
Right. Yeah. So this is the concepts again. So I just want to sort of quickly talk about the design process here before we get into the actual
Beautiful.
like
Yeah.
creation process. So a lot of what we do starts with, like, as you said, these assets are very expensive to make, right? Because they involve Tom sitting down and painting an entire level every time. And I think we have maybe 60 levels in the game, something like that.
Oh my goodness.
And they're sitting on Photoshops that might be like, the Photoshop document might be something like 16,000 pixels by
Oh my
10,000 pixels or
gosh.
something. So they're pretty large. They have hundreds of layers.
Mhm.
Um, so these assets are too expensive to make while you're designing the game, right?
Mhm.
We have to design it first and then build them out. So we start with loads and loads of concepts. And Tom, I mean, I think these look pretty cool, but Tom would hate the fact that I'm showing them to you. Like he sees these as like disgusting, rough fridge drawings.
Mhm.
Um, so but he can do these real fast. And we do a lot of like, so I do the game design in the game, so I generally make the puzzle and decide on the kind of mechanics that the creatures are going to have. um, and then Tom will do tons and tons of concept work, loads and loads of it, so that we can find something. Essentially we choose together, like, what does this fish need to do? Can we animate it in a cool way? If we take Tom's asset, like, will it be really expensive to animate, or can we animate it sensibly? Does it read well, that it has the power that it has? Like this thing at the top middle is like a smashing fish, and we needed to read that you could smash stuff with its big smashy head. Um, and then also the other process is building tons and tons and tons of plants and decorative objects. So
Mhm.
Tom has like a massive library in Photoshop of stuff he's just sat down and spent days just drawing, like looking through ocean picture books and things like that, and coming up with like, here's like a page of 100 corals. Um, and then so we build all of that up, and then he can kind of put that inside Photoshop. Like he can, you know, he doesn't have to hand draw that coral every single time. He can place it 20 times in a scene, but he's still kind of composing the scene in Photoshop. Um, so yeah, this is the terrain process. So we all of these screens on the left are like direct. That's just the full screen view of the Photoshop image.
Mhm.
So that's in like 3 stages. So the first one is we decide on a kind of shape for the level that basically fits my puzzle that I want to put in it, right? So the puzzle here is lots of interlocking, like it's a late game puzzle, and there's lots of difficult kind of inferences you have to make, where you have to pass through using different creature powers, and eventually unlock all of the blockers that help you get out of the room. So we start with a kind of what Tom calls my like fridge drawings, where I build the Photoshop file, and that's just the collider, just the colliding layer, and then all the red stuff is just me sketching to show Tom what I need to happen in this level.
Mhm.
And then Tom will just like really, you know, he'll build the colliding layer out first, because that's usually what's necessary for gameplay. So in this case, it's the white. Um, and then start work on some backgrounds, and then he'll like build those up layer by layer. Um, and you can see sort of the bottom right is the finished Photoshop, and the bottom left, and the right side of the screen is just the in-game screenshot from like that part. You can see, I guess it matches up to the sort of lower left of the bottom image.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so the process, like this is like what the Photoshop file looks like.
Mhm.
I should have gotten the size. This is insanely big. Like every one of those squares is 1024 pixels. Um,
Oh my
so
gosh, I'm dying here.
like we had to replace Tom's computer a few times because the memory use for Photoshop was too high. But the idea here is that we have a kind of script set that, like, it looks at the layer names. So it spits out all of the layers as PNGs, as like their own separate big massive PNG.
Mhm.
And then inside C# and Unity, we have some editors code that can like read all of this and like pull metadata out of the layer names. So this is quite a simple one. It doesn't have a lot of gameplay in it, but you can see like there's one there that's layer 0 collider hidden.
Mhm.
And so the collider tag is what means the game will build a collider around the transparency, and
Mhm.
hidden means don't show this. Background is like a sort of special positioning where it's basically like behind fog, but not parallaxed off in the distance.
Mhm.
And then we have things like layer 1, 2, 3, 4. So they're like the 1, 2, 3, 4 each. When we import it, we have like a sort of Z spacing uh, level we can use, right? So layer 1 would maybe go 5 meters back in Unity. Layer 2 would go 10 meters back, 15 meters back for layer 3, etc. And then we do some like projection. So this gets basically each as you go further back, you get expanded so that you see this in the perspective camera as opposed to the ortho camera.
Mhm.
That's the main thing that's changing. So the idea is to try to get it as close in game as what Tom sees when he draws this, because he wants total control of how the game is composed. Like he is used to being able to paint exactly what he wants his audience to see. And he hates the idea that it could be framed badly or composed badly. He's really against that.
Mhm.
So all of this work was built so that Tom could make a Photoshop file, and then we could just ingest it into game, and it should look as close to that as we could possibly make it.
Mhm.
So that's the in-game screenshot from that Photoshop file.
Mhm.
And there's no like human I run a script, it takes a couple minutes, and then that's what it shows up like in game. We can instantly play it with that like that full rendered art. So that was the thing we had to crack to make this game work. We had to make that script set that could do all of this, and we can do some other stuff with it as well. So we can put like, if a piece of terrain is breakable, for example, we can like hook up all of the game code that makes that work just by naming the layer as breakable, and things like exits and entrances and what they lead to. Like, there's a bunch of stuff we can just add layers in Photoshop, and they just sort of show up playable in the game. And it took a long time to put all of that together, just piece by piece. But now we end up with this system where we can basically do level design entirely in Photoshop, which is really good for Tom.
Mhm.
So I
Mhm.
guess this is the challenge of having an artist that isn't a games artist. Because if you trained as a games artist, you'd probably think it was insane to do all of this, and you just work in Unity or
just
whatever, right?
just a touch, just a touch. I mean, it's beautiful, but just a touch. Like it's nuts.
Yeah. So partly, one thing I understand about all of this is it's probably not the best way to do this. It's just that it's the way that works with Tom,
Mhm.
and Tom is a really like he's extremely talented person, and he has an absolute mastery over his pen and ink.
Yes,
But if we were forcing him to use programs he didn't really know,
absolutely.
this whole time we would not be getting his best work. He would be like fighting and miserable, and he wouldn't be creative, and he wouldn't be doing good work. So and we tried, right? Like we tried early on to like try different ways, bit more traditional game designy kind of ways, and he just bounced off them.
Yeah.
So this was the big challenge in Silt. Was we had to work together to try and find a pipeline that worked for him and that got the best out of him, and we weren't wasting his talent just like fighting a badly written Unity tool or something.
Now, those images right there, you said each one of those squares is 1024.
Yeah.
Is it reduced in the final
No.
Unity project?
So what the scripts do as part of what they do is they take each one of these giant PNGs, the whole layer,
Mhm.
and they split it into those grid squares.
Okay.
So in Unity, there's actually, what would this be, 8 by 14 or something
Mhm.
sprite
Mhm.
renderers for the level. And they're all displaying the sprite that matches that little section, and the script is like placing them around in the place that makes them look like they're one thing again.
Mhm.
It's also doing some optimizations, right? If it detects a blank, like a fully transparent square, it just removes it. It can do some other stuff to try to make it a little bit less crazy on draw calls.
Mhm.
But ultimately, each one of our levels are like about 6 to 10 layers of this sort of stuff.
Wow.
Um, we also, we can do some optimization in there. There's some merging, and there's some stuff we can do to like save a little bit of the craziness, but really it's not super efficient. And the sprite on grid square A19 is completely different to the sprite on grid square A20, even if they share mostly the same texture or whatever. So we do lose a lot of efficiency,
Mhm.
but it means we don't have obvious repeating textures anywhere. We don't have like this sort of, there's just a look that 2D games that are built around tile sets have, and we didn't
Yes,
want
you're
that.
right. You're right. And I'm assuming this is going to be able to be ported over to iOS as well, right?
Uh, we haven't got plans for iOS, but we are coming to. Well, shit, I actually can't say things.
Can't say
I,
it. Don't
I, I
don't
can't
don't
say.
say it. Keep
Sorry.
it away. Keep it
No, no.
away.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
But
So
it will it this okay, so to stop it being crazy, to stop it like
yeah,
completely overloading video memory and
yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
really what we have is just a limit on how big we can make these scenes.
Gotcha,
So we can't get much bigger than this Photoshop file.
gotcha.
Uh, Otherwise, we end up with like insane amounts of memory use.
Right.
Um, so that's the limitation. It's if you use tile sets, you could have infinite worlds that are just constantly spawning themselves in, right? Whereas
Mhm,
this one
mhm.
is like we have to load this whole chunk, and if we make it much bigger, we have long loading times and we have very high video memory use.
Richard asked a great question. Was that the big selling point? Like when you pitched it to the publishers, did you say we're not repeating stuff? You're not going to see the same environment over and over again. This is everything is going to be hand drawn.
Actually, no, I don't think we were thinking about that as a selling point at the time. I think like honestly, I think what made us. Oh, I'm sorry if I'm supposed to be reading chat. I haven't been seeing it. Just forgive me if I'm missing things in chat that I should be picking up.
Oh,
Um,
no worries, no worries. But yeah, that.
so so yeah, like we didn't pitch that it would be non-repeating, but we did show, you know, what the art can look like in game and stuff. But honestly, back when we were pitching, we hadn't really finished this whole system.
Yeah.
We really just had these sort of very small. In fact, I think when we were pitching, we were still using this setup that just use shapes and turn them into meshes
Mhm,
rather than actually sprites.
mhm,
We had some like triangulation and outline rendering sort of stuff. So we did the same thing with the Photoshop, but they would turn into these textured meshes, which were way more efficient, but they were ugly.
mhm.
Um, so we probably didn't actually have this level of art detail when we were pitching, but we did have some of the nice creature assets and things like that, and the lighting and stuff. So yeah, like that's the terrain part of the process.
Mhm.
Which was we really had to crack that to be able to have a game. Like the game was riding on us being able to crack that. Uh, and it's not the most elegant solution. Like the Photoshop scripts kind of churn through a lot of data and it takes up a lot of space on disk. Our GitHub repos are enormous.
Mhm.
Um, but other than that, like it works and it creates quite a stable, easy to iterate on situation at the end. So the other big thing was dynamic lighting. So
Mhm.
when Tom draws, he draws these really strong highlights, and you see that on the right. That's just just him drawing on a piece of paper. Um, so these were the kind of tests he would do, and like I said, for everything in the game, Tom would draw it, and it was like, make it look like that, please. Um, so the challenge here was like, oh, well, how do you do that, but with the lighting being able to be dynamic and coming on and off and all this kind of stuff? So the clear answer is normal mapping, but
Mhm.
we went the blessing for us was that just as we were starting, the Unity's 2D renderer came out and
Yes.
we switched to that and it was immediately doing what we wanted it to do. So it plays really nicely with normal maps. Because I think the first versions of the game, it had 3D lights and we had to like lift the lights off of the plane a little bit to get the normal maps to look right. And it was really wasteful, like pointlessly wasteful 3D lighting for what
So
we
are
were
you
trying to
guys
do.
on 2019 then? What if I'm just
2020, but yeah,
2020?
we moved up to very quickly moved up to whatever the version that the 2D renderer came out in, which I
Gotcha.
think was 2018.3 maybe.
Maybe, yeah, something like that.
Um, and they've made some improvements to it since, but really, like from there, we just write most of the assets in the game are taken care of by one kind of Uber sprite shader type thing that just has lots of variants and um, things like that. So getting the lighting right was really important, and the 2D lighting system in Unity really helped with that. We also have a bloom layer in post processing, which you can see, which Tom kind of draws bloom by hand.
Mhm.
So we knew we needed that too, but it's fairly trivial to put bloom in.
Yeah.
And then so this would be like the diver rig and the normal map. And we also have space in the shaders for some other maps. So like all the possessed creatures, they have a highlight when you
Ah,
hold your possession to show that you can use them.
okay.
So we do a kind of alpha like an edge glow in
Mhm.
Photoshop and print that to a texture. And then the shader can read that if it wants to. So we have a couple of maps in the texture. There's like a glow map as well, so we can have like emissive layers and stuff. Um, but it's not. This isn't groundbreaking by any means. This is just a standard sprites shader, really,
Mhm.
just modified to have what we want in it. And then the other big part of Silt is the animated assets, so like the big ones especially, and then VFX. So again, like to harp on, Tom draws them, and then we have to make them look like that in game. So that was his, on the left was his concept for how the possession effect should look. And you take something like that and you're like, well, that's real pretty, but I have no idea how to make that happen dynamically. Um, so you sort of start with this thing, you know, you're not going to quite make it to. Oh,
Mhm.
sorry. And then you just, I guess I just sit down and do a load of math and like see if I can figure out a way to do this just with math. And then on the left here is the sort of effect in game. So it's you know, it's looking at what he does. It's like figuring out what math might represent that. So that's just a bunch of like standing sine waves in the gap and some Bezier curve stuff. And you know, it's just math. It's just wobbling some waves around. But it was basically, the idea was like, how close can we get to this where we can still control it and we can still, it does the gameplay things we need to do.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, it doesn't look the same, but it's enough to please Tom. And once Tom gives a sign off, that's the good stuff.
Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Obviously, that's an important one because it's their main interaction in the game as well. You do it all the time, so it needs to look nice. Um, yeah, and then the animation rigs. So these were the other insanely expensive things in the game.
Mhm.
That if I was making a game again, I would design these out of the game. Um, so again, on the left is Tom drawing it in Photoshop. Some of that came from pen and paper, scanned in. Some of it is sort of helped along digitally, but he draws it and then cuts it into pieces and layers it. And then the layers are what you see on the right. Like if you were to go through every Photoshop layer and solo it,
Ah.
you would see what would come out in the right, like one by one. So that's what the animation program kind of spits out as an atlas eventually.
Mhm.
So we use a program called Spine, which is a brilliant 2D animation program, and we have an animator based in Kiev, Ukraine, and he does all of the kind of actual animation work in Spine. Um, and really, the hardest thing in Silt is that um, we've got these big creatures and they're not fixed in place, so they can kind of freely move around a bit. And I don't know, I was probably naive going into this, but I didn't realize that that was the hardest thing you could do, is have a big animation rig interacting with other rigs, and the player can be anywhere in any direction around it, and it's got to track it, and it's got to like, I will never do that again until I have like a team of 10 animators, because it was a nightmare. And we tried to ended up having to design some of the interaction out just because of how hard it is to like have a free moving interactive animation asset that doesn't look garbage when it interacts with stuff.
Mhm.
So I'm sure there are way more talented technical animators in this room than I am. It's not my specialty at all. And I just couldn't make this work consistently. I think we pitched the game with 8 of these, and there's 4 of them in the final game.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So they ended up being insanely expensive and just making me cry. But you know, they look cool, they work, and we did get it to work. And so like that's the in-game lit version on the top right there, and then the same I think from the other concept before, like bottom right there is a concept art, and that's it in game. So the beautiful thing with Tom is that he can just keep producing like the high quality assets. So the assets weren't so difficult. It was just making sure we could animate them well.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, like that's basically the process. That's, I mean, at least what I think are two of the kind of most interesting challenges we had, right? Like figuring out how to get the terrain into the game consistently, and then doing animations and stuff as well.
Okay.
So I'm happy to talk about anything else you're interested in, but that's what I prepared for our process part of it.
That's incredible. So, okay, the first question I have is um the game overall size. You mentioned 60 levels, right? So
Mhm.
gameplay wise, how long do you think the average player is going to experience this world?
So the full game, it's a linear game. You know, just like Limbo was, where you just kind of start and you progress through and you get to the end.
Mhm.
So if I sit down and play the game, like knowing it as I do, I play through in about an hour,
Mhm.
and new players play the game in about 3 hours.
Okay. Okay. Is there like load screens in between each level that go to each stage, or is it
Yeah,
just?
so you get a kind of 1 second longish dip to
Mhm,
black between
mhm.
each stage, and that was another thing. It was a kind of like, maybe if we'd have figured that out, I'd be sitting here talking about how we solved that, but it seems so difficult to have a streaming system.
It really it's exhausting, and I
Yeah.
mean you can put infinite scenes into Unity, and it just loads up a lot quicker.
Yeah, and it would have created really strong constraints. For example, like
Mhm.
every one of those Photoshop files, Tom would have to have the left and the right one, or the top and the bottom one up
Absolutely.
too, and like match them perfectly by pixel by pixel.
Mhm.
Um, Plus, like, just the CPU budget for constantly loading levels is bonkers. So I have this on good authority from people in Playdead, but Limbo, I think, spends half of its CPU budget all the time streaming.
Wow.
Maybe it was a third, but it was a significant chunk of its CPU time is just pulling levels off disk and
Really?
putting just to give you that. And it's completely seamless in game. They do it
Mhm.
amazingly.
Mhm.
But just off to the left and the right of the screen, you obviously have loads of stuff being like yanked in off the hard drive. And so that would have been cool to have
Mhm.
done that in Silt, but it seemed like such a difficult challenge, and it probably would
Absolutely.
have sunk the game if we tried to do it.
Well, and it's like an artist in a canvas. I mean, you're given certain paint colors, you make it work, and
Yeah, sure.
you have to use the load scenes, so you have to make it work somehow. If you could pull it off stylishly, excellent. If it doesn't look obvious, no one's going to care. When people talk about making levels that just and never end or with no load screen, I always like to bring them back to the fact that Half-Life had load screens. Half-Life
Yeah.
Alex has load screens. I mean, that is the greatest VR game ever, and it has load screens everywhere. It doesn't mean that your game suffers anything in that. It's a technical boundary that we just have to accept.
Yeah. We had to push to try to minimize the load times for sure,
Mhm,
because you see the screen often enough that like it would be irritating, especially if you die and you came back and there was a long load screen. Like, that was something that was present for a little while and playtesters hated it.
mhm.
So like, making sure that it was responsive when you pop back to life. And yeah, you don't want players to be sitting at load screens. I think it's a weird thing, isn't it? There's like I don't know what the word would be, like a beat or a moment or something, but there's a time which, if the load screen stays on, and it's somewhere in the region of like 2 to 3 seconds, I think. But if it stays on for just past that point, your brain just goes from like content to annoyed, and and I think you just bounce players off. So like, it's important that they stay low, but it was much easier for us to spend engineering work doing that than it was to spend engineering work building a streaming system, because
Yeah.
that would have bled into artwork and design work as well, which it would have been a nightmare.
So you get so many things from Tom. How do you manage, like, how often does it come in to you, like, how do you guys collaborate, because it looks like you gave him kind of an outline of a level, and you said, all right, this is what I need you to make, and he makes it. Like, does it come in about a week, 2 weeks? Like, what is the average turnaround for that?
Yeah, there are some things that are cheaper than others, right? So some of the levels he can throw together, especially levels. All right, so that was an expensive level,
Hmm.
because he needs to sit down and paint that giant thing that's like the main thing, right? Like, that's a unique piece of art, and it has actually been through that that creature has been like 4 different creatures as we've been processing it, all done to that level of detail as well. So like, even just changing designs are expensive. So yeah, something like this might take Tom 3 or 4 days.
Hmm.
But that's when he knows exactly what he wants to paint, not including design work and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So, but the beauty of this, right, is that as a level, you just swim in and swim back out again.
Yeah.
So for something like this, he can keep changing it without really affecting anything I'm doing. So I can keep building the rest of the game, and he can work in the background. And every time he has an updated level, I just run those scripts and it's in game.
Hmm.
So really, what we end up with is a situation where the kind of gameplay elements get locked earlier.
Hmm.
So generally, these scribbles also include instructions as to like, the width of this gap is important, or the placement of this is important, or something, right?
Hmm.
And Tom will fight to like be able to have full artistic control over everything, but he can just about be reined in to say like, all right, I'll make this gap this wide or something, right? or this elevator has to be here and it has to be this wide because we already have an asset for it or whatever. So generally we lock the important stuff, and then Tom can kind of work to do the detail work in kind of background stuff. So he's tied to the same milestone as us, but we tend to start off a milestone where we do loads of design work up front. We figure out what we're going to make, and then we kind of break and we all go and like make our own part of it as quickly as possible. So I try to stand up the gameplay and the new fish interactions if we have them, and then Tom will stand up like the animation rigs for the fish and send them off to Anton, and we'll start building all the terrains, but in these, like, I guess you'd call them gray boxes, right? But these blocky outlines from the top left here. So we can just put them in game, like we can put the rest of the level in game. We just run the scripts at that point and we just get what we had there, so like I can still work before the details in. And then we can just keep overlaying detail on top of it like that. So yeah, some of them that are more, you can see there's a lot of repetition in this level, right? Like he's clearly using these kind of background textures a bit. He's using the texture of this kind of grate on the front. So they might be a bit cheaper than something like that has like its own thing in it. So for, where is it? Do we have one? It's back in the pitchy bit. Yeah, like there's some really expensive, time-consuming art in this one, and some of the bits that are supposed to be more spectacular, Tom might spend 2 weeks on. But that's still faster than if he was just painting, because he might spend months on a painting.
So this concept is so surreal. Was there ever a place where you guys were building the game, you guys had a rough outline of how it was going to begin and end, and then at a certain point you're like, yeah, it might be cool to pitch it this way instead, or change the ending to this, or do this differently? Like, was there any type of scope creep adjustment to change the original navigation of how the game was going to flow?
Yeah, there was a lot for a very long time, right from the beginning, right from the Stugan work. We were talking about how we were going to, like, what the beginning, middle, and end of the game should be, and what the kind of structure of the game should be. Because the game was, what we knew we were going to do was swim around and have environmental puzzles and have the complexity of those puzzles determined by what creatures were there and what they could do, right? And try to do things like, once you have 3 or 4 different creatures, maybe you can up the complexity by mixing the which ones you use and having powers that rely on other powers, things like that, right? So that was the thing that never changed. But then the idea of like how it's going to end, or like what the quote unquote story is and stuff like that, we were fighting about that the entire time, and like trying different things. And at some point you have to decide on something because you got to make it, right? So like at some point we were like, what is going to be in the ending? And I could show you just pages and pages and pages of variations of concept art and things like that. But eventually you have to build it, and that kind of locks it in. So we were basically just doing it that way, right? Like the last possible minute, we were committing on like a structure to the ending. And then once that was committed, then it was about like really what we did was kind of backfill a lot of detail. So as we started to understand what the kind of story shape of the game was, the narrative shape of the game was, we started to go back through the original levels and try to backfill those levels with lore that like visually connected to the ending, and then through that way make it seem like we were more deliberate. But like, so Tom and I are both big fans of David Lynch, and like that was one of our sort of bonding things when we first met, and it's kind of stuck with us. But one thing David Lynch absolutely steadfastly refuses to do is tell people what his film is about. And I think that I don't think that's him just being like a kind of arrogant artist. I think it's specifically that the way he works is he just shoots until he has a movie in his can, right? You just keep shooting, you keep making stuff, and then eventually you've got 12 hours of footage, and that's a movie. So you edit it until it looks like a real movie or whatever. But like, I don't think the directing creative force is on this sort of as if you had a novel that you were adapting, right? Where you have this story that already exists. It's about finding the story in the edit. And I think that's how Silt is built as well. Like we might not have been too deliberate about it, but like if I was to describe the process, it was find the story in the edit, find the story in this reams and reams of artwork that Tom is producing, and do it that way. Yeah. So yeah, we didn't have an ending until we absolutely had to have an ending, and then we kind of went from there and like backfilled loads of detail in that made it seem more deliberate.
Oh wow, yeah, yeah. This is going to be an absolute just experience. I can't wait for this. What systems is this going to come out on that you can tell us?
I'm only allowed to say that we're announced on PC, so we
Thank
should come out on various storefronts on PC.
you. Okay.
The only official announcement so far is Steam, so
Okay.
it's the only one I can say we're definitely going to. But
Totally
yeah,
understood.
just but like keep an eye out on the Twitter, or
Mhm.
I should go to the last page. You can actually copy that stuff down. Um, yeah, keep an eye out, and we will be trying quite hard, obviously, to announce it if we have any news about that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
And if you do want to get in touch, like one of us will see the Twitter, or you could just email that info address and it'll come to me and Tom. So if you do have any questions about any of this stuff, just mention that you were here, and give me a shout. Yeah.
Okay. Richard had one last question. What did the publishers consider the most important reason on why they wanted to back this project?
The art,
Yeah.
100%.
Mhm.
It was the art, and then I think they did a little bit of work to just make sure, like, do you have enough ideas to carry a whole game,
Mhm.
gameplay wise,
Mhm.
right? So like the original demo, we had some possession mechanics, and we had a couple of different creatures that had like, so we had like an electric eel that could power up machines, and then we have like the chompy plant and the smashy guy and stuff like that, right? So I think the demo had just enough gameplay variety in that they could see, right, I can see how you could fill a hole, like a 3 to 4 hour experience with stuff out
Mhm.
of this toolbox.
Mhm.
But what got us in the door and what got us the deal, I think, really was the art. It's just we just needed to show just enough gameplay to make the art like, function as a game.
Mhm. Do you find this amazing that we have come to the point in video games where it's not about high scores and lives and all this other stuff, but you can actually create a game like yours, like Limbo, like Inside, where it's just about the experience. It's not about beating a boss. It's about playing the experience, and there doesn't need to be massive amounts of dialogue or acting or voice work or one thing. It's just being there in this world. It's almost indescribable. It's not like you can sit down and talk about like a common AAA game. It's just you have to do it. You have to play Journey to know what Journey is about. You don't talk about it. You don't share it. You don't detail everything out. I mean, I feel like this game just comes around the perfect time in most gamers just the game development life cycle and journey in general, where more media is focused in on it, more attention's focused on it, and something like this can really bounce and really resonate with an audience who may be just too oversaturated with just war games or twitchy massive multiplayer games, and they just want to experience something for 3 hours that will just take them away from that world.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of those people. And I love, like, not to disparage any of the kind of,
Absolutely.
the games that you sink 120 hours into, because they're awesome too. But and I certainly play a lot of them. Like, I love a sports game.
Mhm.
But yeah, these kind of, I guess the thing that both me and Tom were really surprised, like pleasantly surprised about when we joined this industry, especially Tom, was that there's a really big appetite for weird stuff in games.
Mhm.
Um, because I don't know, maybe there is in movies too, but like I feel like there's it's pretty, it would be pretty hard to pitch Silt as an indie movie. Like, it's this weird movie and it has just lots of weird imagery in it, and you're just gonna sort of enjoy seeing the imagery. Like, nobody's gonna chuck money at that. Netflix aren't picking that up. But I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. It's outside my world, so it's not fair to speak on it. But we felt like there was all of a sudden like a much bigger appetite and actual commercial possibilities with weird stuff in games.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know whether it's just that gamers just have a bit more tolerance, or maybe it's the fact that you're playing it and that engages you in a way that you would gives you more tolerance for weird stuff. But I
Mhm.
think people really like weird, surreal stuff in games.
Mhm.
Um, I would say one more contrarian thing as well, though. But like, you know, the game sort of, if you took away all of that like stylization and the something like Inside and Limbo, where they're just dripping in all of this beautiful art design and atmosphere and stuff. Without all of that, it's the same game as Mario. It's
Mhm.
just Mario,
Mhm.
and Silt is just Mario where you swim instead of like it's giving the player a reason to push right and keep going and stuff.
Mhm.
And yeah, and I think it is just like a sign of like maturity in the industry that we don't all just have to be chasing numbers up on the screen, and that people want something that has an emotional side to it as opposed to a just a like. And don't get me wrong, I love watching those numbers get up as well.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
I do love playing games that reward that sort of stuff as well.
Mhm.
I just think that there's, I don't know, maybe it's because you're playing it, maybe it's because you've got your hands on the controller and you have some sense of identification with the avatar that you're playing as, that like it lets you suspend disbelief better, or it lets you suspend your kind of impatience to do something else
Mhm. Mhm.
or something like that. But for whatever reason, the gaming public will pick up and pay for a game
Yeah.
that just has you, think about like the walking simulators that
Mhm.
came out like 5 years ago, right?
Absolutely.
I love some of those games, and I'm happy to pay like £20 to just like shuffle about in a weird sandbox and like have a lovely time. So yeah, I don't know. For whatever reason, for now, we've still got an industry that has like a financial appetite for games like this, and
Well,
I,
then there's
I just
also a maturity in the industry as well, where it's not just 10-year-old boys playing spaceships anymore. Now it's adults, it's women, it's everybody has a gaming device of some sort, and there's no stigma attached to it anymore. So it's really, what are you interested in, and we can find that universe for you. So if Call of Duty doesn't fit what you want, but Silt does, this is your perfect match. This is something you can really dive into, and a lot of people, their tastes don't align with violent games that are so commercial, and they
well,
want.
that was another a really important part for us, is that I'm not interested in the power fantasy game, in making one. I'm
Mhm.
not interested in having the player do loads of like human killing and
Yeah.
things like that. It's just I'm just over that a little bit.
Mhm.
But the and again, not to say I don't play games like that, like I do, but these interests aren't mutually exclusive, right? You can play Call of Duty for, you spend the whole weekend playing Call of Duty with your friends, and then one night you might see that the, I don't know, Game Pass has a cool new indie on it. You
Mhm.
just play that for 3 hours instead, and then go back to playing Call of Duty or whatever, right? Like we don't have to limit ourselves to
Mhm.
one thing or another. We can, and I guess the beauty of a short experience like this is that it can just be slotted into somebody else's time, like wherever they have a bit of time. It doesn't have to, it doesn't demand like a 40-hour commitment of you or anything like that.
Mhm. Well, Dominic, this was fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time. I was truly excited about hearing from you and learning more about this game, because again, we've been keeping an eye on this for a very long time, and I'm really excited to see that this is going to be coming out next year. And Fortunately, next year is only like, I don't know, 20 days away. So
Yeah.
it's very very optimistic. Please keep us up to date on any new updates and changes. We're going to keep an eye on your Twitter feed to make sure we know it, and hopefully, maybe sometime next year we can reach out again and talk to you and see how the game release is going, because I really do feel that this thing is going to blow up and it's going to be tremendous.
Well, I do hope so. It's a tough market out there for indie games as well, right? Like a lot of games don't make their money back, and I think you have to go into it expecting that it might not.
Mhm.
But who knows? We'll see. And yeah, maybe we can come back and do a little bit of a post-mortem, and you can see, what the other end of it looks like. Because I've never seen that. This is my first game, so
Right. Thank you, Dom. Any last words to leave us with before we call it a day?
no, I hope this has been useful to some of you. And if you do have any questions that are more relevant to like what you're interested in professionally, and not just like me mouthing off about my game, do feel free to ask them. I probably didn't like anticipate too many of them. So,
Perfect. Thank you so much. And again, everybody who joined us, thank you for joining us today and experiencing this.
all right, thanks everyone for listening.